lot of you guys have been asking for a coloring tutorial, so I finally made one, yay! I found that the best genre that describes this type of art style is called hyperpop, or eye strain art. If you search one or the other on Pinterest, something similar will probably come up. So yeah, the reason why everyone likes this art style is because it scratches your brain. It's really fun to draw yourself, but using lots of saturated colors can be a bit tricky and hard to pull off, so I'm going to show you guys my process and hopefully some color theory tips that'll help you to draw in this type of art style too. I've broken it down into 4 steps. Step 1 is deciding on a line style, Step 2 is finding a color palette, Step 3 is sorting your color palette into values. I know it's confusing, just bear with me. And then Step 5 is just rendering and drawing in your final detail stuff. So firstly, the line work type. Do you want a sketchy, painterly type of style, or do you want a more clean looking, polished style? If you want the sketchy, painted type of style, then you should paint on top of your sketch. This is the one I usually use just because I think that line art is really tedious and I hate doing it. Anyway, black lines create more tonal value, but too much of it you have to be careful with because otherwise it takes away from the brain scratchiness that we all know and love. So be careful with that. For the line art, it doesn't matter what type it is. Usually people tend to color their line art whatever palette that you've chosen. Step 2 is finding a color palette. Choosing your color palette can be confusing because there are literally millions of color palettes to choose from. And it might get a bit daunting to look at, and also trying to figure out what colors go where and what complements with what. But I'm going to break it down into simple concepts and techniques that I usually use when I make my color palettes. The first technique I use is complementary colors. Now everybody probably already knows this, but in case you don't, this is a color wheel. Complementary colors are just the opposite colors on a color wheel. For the sake of the tutorial, I'm using the original red, yellow, and blue color wheel. I know there are newer ones right now, but this is the easiest one to understand in terms of color theory. I don't really know the science behind why complementary colors work well together, but I guess they just do. I don't know. The second technique I use is, well, I don't know if this is an actual thing, but it's analogous but complementary. So basically, on a 12-sided color wheel, you choose 3 colors that are next to each other, which is called analogous. And you also take the 3 colors opposite to them and use that as a color scheme. Now the most common one I use is this one, and I also use this one a few times as well. I really use this one because I hate the color green. The reason why I like this one better than just a plain old complementary one is because it adds more variety to your colors while still looking cohesive and not that random, but still a little bit random. And the last technique I use when creating color palettes is it's a thing I also made up. It's called the pizza slice system. Basically how it works is that you take 2 or 3 shades of the 12-sided color wheel and you use every other color. My favorite one to use is the one without green shades because I hate the color green. But yeah, I use this one a lot. This one is a little bit harder than the other 2 because you have to understand where to put your colors inside of the painting and try to balance everything. So I suggest if you're a beginner, you should start off with using the other color schemes first and then moving on to this one once you get more confident. Step 3 is sorting the colors that you've picked out into tonal values. Now, okay, stay with me. I know this is a little confusing, but basically, we want saturated colors. That's the whole point of eye strain art. But how do you know what colors to put where? Because if you just put a bunch of random colors everywhere, even if they have a certain color scheme, sometimes the values are off and it blends too much into the background. Basically, each color on the color wheel has its respective tonal value, which basically means how dark it is when you turn it grayscale. So as you can see, the darkest are blue, purple, and red. The lightest is yellow, cyan, the yellow-green, and a bit of the orange, and then the rest are just midtones. So what does this have to do with eye strain art? Well, this is where I'm gonna blow your mind. All you basically have to do when drawing in your shadows is use the dark-ended tonal value colors, and when you're doing your highlights where the light source hits the most, you use the light colors that have the least amount of tonal value, if that makes sense. I made a chart here so it's an easier reference. Then for your midtones, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. You don't have to use the most saturated colors of all time when you're drawing it in your midtones. You can just have a simple skin color. It doesn't have to be saturated. Here, from one of my examples, I chose this color palette. I did the cake method by choosing every color in the color wheel except for the blue and cyan section. So I sorted these colors into tonal values, the lightest ones at the bottom, mid-tones, and then the darkest ones at the top. On this side, I did desaturate them a little bit, so there's a little more variation in the saturation. It just makes it look a little more interesting, in my opinion. So you can see that I used the darkest parts like red and purple for the darkest parts of his hair, his eye patch, under the chin, and even the line art. And then for the highlights, I used yellow and the bright green and the pink tones for the middle of the hair because I thought it would complement the green. But yeah, that's how I did this. I also did this one, which is the same thing, but instead I'm using the more clean line art type just to give you guys an example. Now I'm gonna go through another example but using everything that I've taught you guys so far. So first I finished doing the sketch and then I paint the base colors that are as close to the reference image as I can. Don't worry about the bright colors right now, these are just the base colors. So the color palette I'm using for this is my favorite one. The darkest is a purple and blue, midtones are red, orange, and pink, and a skin tone, and then the highlights will be in cyan and yellow. Basically, I put an orange overlay on top of the base colors. This is going to be what your light source is going to look like. And then on top of that, you're going to clip a dark toned color onto the base color layer and then set the blending mode to either linear burn or color burn. You can play with which ones you want. Usually I use color burn because it has more of a saturated effect. But yes, then you're just going to cut out where the light is, if that makes sense. I'm airbrushing more of the orange from his hair into the shadows of his clothes as well. This is going to be more of the mid-tone area rather than the darkest part of like purple and blue. Then I'm going to color the line art. This is what makes it look more lineless, I think. And I'm just coloring the line art so that you know where the light hits. It's hitting from the upper left corner on his hair. Now I'm gonna paint over the sketch layer so that it has more of a lineless look. I like to paint outside of the lines, but this is just my style. You don't have to do this. Like the original Kaya example I showed in this step, I'm exaggerating the highlights. So around his hair, the scarf, and just anywhere where the light hits, you use those colors, cyan and yellow. And then another layer, you use your saturated dark colors, so that's purple and blue. I'm using it in the corners where it is the least amount of light hitting, not the basic shadows. Those are more for the mid-tone colors. And then I put more of an orange overlay on top of everything because I thought it would contrast with the background more. And yeah, I'm having an identity crisis over what background I want to choose, so I settled on this ice looking thing. Now I'm adding the final little details. I don't really render that much because this is what my style is like. Also, I drew this on my phone and I hate rendering on my phone. If you feel like your colors aren't working together, just take one of the main colors you're using as a light source and slap an overlay blending mode layer on top of it. Everything just somehow works together a little better. I use this all the time. I literally just use it in the child thing to make it contrast with the background a bit more.
And now I want to sit back and relax and enjoy my evening. When all of a sudden I hear this agitating, grating voice.
Hopefully this video was helpful towards you. I really hope it was because I've never made a tutorial before.